Hello, my name is Bob Starr. I have been associated with Faraday Foundation and Faraday Studios for several years now. Let me say up front that I am honored to host this series of interviews with Steve Jacobs, Wizard 4. During the first session, Jake will be providing an overview of the four science wizards and their contributions as scientists and communicators. Jake, how did it all get started? And where did the term science wizard originate?
Oh my goodness. Well, let's see. I guess the bragging rights that we take, 226 years ago is when it all started, 1795. I suppose maybe it'd be a few years before that. 1791 was the year of Michael Faraday's birth. And about 4 years later, the Royal Institution of Great Britain was founded in London. And it was an organization dedicated to applied science. The Royal Society in London was where all the famous scientists, would gather and talk about what they knew of the day. And that was more pure scientific gatherings. And the Royal Institution wanted to apply science to the daily life, or what they called the common purposes of life. So that was the starting point of this whole thing, was Faraday's birth and the foundation of or the founding, I guess, of the Royal Institution of Great Britain is where it all started. And Michael Faraday, which when we get to talking about Faraday completely in another session, people consider him probably one of the most beloved scientists that's ever walked on the planet Earth. They say if there would have been Nobel Prizes awarded in his lifetime, he would have earned 4 at least. And he was Wizard 1. And we'll come back later how that got started. Well, I guess I'll say it right now, because that's what we're doing, right? Faraday started, and we'll do this in length, so I'll kind of comprise it. If you look up Faraday, try to find a book on the life of Michael Faraday, I would say there's at least 100 biographies. At least. You go online and just look for books on Faraday, and it goes after Faraday, the life and times. A very beloved guy. But he started it with very humble beginnings. His dad was a blacksmith. They were poor. They were in the caste system of Great Britain. You're either royal or gentry or common or poor. Well, he was poor. He was at the bottom, on the bottom rung, and Dad was a blacksmith, which meant that he was given maybe 4 years of rudimentary education before he got a job. So, when you're about 10, 11, 12 years old, that's when you go to work. And that was him. And when you read his writings, he said he despised his grubby hands. Because, if your dad's a blacksmith and you're helping your dad, what do you think your hands are going to look like? Just grubby, which would remind you every day of how poor you were. And he was of smallish stature, so that probably aggravated the situation. He was very sensitive to the fact that he was poor and he couldn't communicate well. His vocabulary was small. And so that was kind of a thing, a cloud that hung over his life and we'll go into it later, but his life made a massive change. As he got older, he wanted to improve himself. They belonged to a very strict Sandemanian type of Christianity, and he was a devout member of the Sandemanian church. And they set up straight, and they did everything like that. They were probably the most stern group of people. And so he had that Christian background and poverty and this terrible desire to be loved and to be accepted and not to be the runt of the village, to be the small dog. And so that was in the back of his mind. He had a chance to escape the blacksmith shop by becoming a bookbinder's assistant. Anything. Can you imagine what it would be like to be a helper to a blacksmith, just lugging the stuff around? Or you can go over and work in a bookbinding shop where you got to sit in a chair all day with these precious things called books. And back in those days, if you bought a book, sometimes you just got a bundle of pages. tied with a string. And then you had to pay the binder to, to do the cheap job if you were poor, or do the leather bound if you're, you could get your books bound. And so he was a bookbinder. And the story is he would kind of borrow those books occasionally to read them. And he loved the ones on natural philosophy. Natural philosophy is kind of the precursor to science. And I'll go into this story, but he eventually ended up on the bottom rung at the Royal Institution. He had a job there. I think he was a bottle washer or whatever. And that, his time at the Royal Institution and working his way up through the ranks, and he eventually became the director of it. A blacksmith's son became the director of the Royal Institution of Great Britain, where all this science was taking place. So that story we'll come back to. And near the end of his life, the Queen Victoria was so proud of him that everybody in the country called him Father Faraday. She allowed him to move into Hampton Court to spend his remaining years. No, I guess that was no nursing homes back then. So Father Faraday got to spend his waning years at the, and I think it was at his eulogy or something when he passed away. Here lies Father Faraday, the wisest one among us. And the term wizard, if you take its root meaning, means wisest one. Edison was the Wizard of Menlo Park. It's an honorary title. He was a wizard. You're a wizard at that, Mr. Wizard. You're supposedly the wisest one on this particular topic among us. And that's where the word wizard got attached to Faraday, but it was not a tongue-in-cheek thing. It was just kind of like, oh, he's a wizard, man. That was what it was. That's how it got started.
Well, before we move on to the next wizard, what do you think Michael Faraday would say about today's communications technologies? Do you think he would change any of his demonstrations? And it's interesting, given the advances he himself made possible because of his discoveries and inventions.
Well, the answer to that question, he would be stupefied if he could walk in and see electric lights and cameras and motors and everything we take for granted. I'm sure the man would need oxygen. He would pass out to say, look what you started. Look at what your electric current started. I mean, it's just, so he would be stupefied. Then I think after the novelty of all these wonderful things that his work led to, I think he would be greatly disappointed in science communicators today. When you read Faraday's writings, he was demanding that every word that came out of his mouth was well rehearsed, well thought out, well planned to the greatest detail. And he would rehearse his lectures and his presentations repeatedly so that this eloquent speech that he had to struggle his whole life to, because he had this old, poor man's accented, heavy, thick brogue of an Englishman's accent, and he tried to clean that up his whole life to become a more elegant speaker. So he was very hard on himself to learn to speak properly, and every word that came out of your mouth was like a bit of beautiful opera. And I guess he was just mesmerizing to hear. It just came out of him like, and you could follow his lecture like you were riding on the back of a bird soaring through the trees. And you're just going, oh. And I think he'd look at the way we communicate now like we're shooting machine guns at each other with words, blah, 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 and you have no time to think about anything, and instant responses, and they're always trying to catch you with catchy words and catchy phrases, and he would spend an hour on a lecture, and people would have to lean back with a headache and go, wow, my head just went halfway around the world with this man. So I think he would be shocked at how we have crammed data together and just shot it out so fast that we're not even enjoying the beauty of it. I think that's what his reaction would be. Wizard One didn't know he was Wizard One at the time. I mean, because I could think that the term was applied to him after his demise. Before that, he was Father Faraday, Michael Faraday, well-respected guy. And so after his death, there was a period of time when there were other people that were science communicators. Nobody was anywhere near what Faraday did. Until in the late 1800s, was at the late 19th century, a young boy was born in the Princeton area, and to a train conductor, a large group of kids. And his father, kind of like Faraday, so there might be something to this, was a train conductor, but he was also the Sunday school superintendent at a huge church, and I guess it had something like 600 kids in it or something. I don't remember the story. I have to look it up. Mr. Allier had this son named Hubert, and Hubert got polio when he was in high school, and it did a little bit of damage to one of his legs, but he had it in his jaw. So the treatment for polio back then was pretty severe. So he had to spend the last part of his high school experience at home in bed because of the polio. And that guy just worked his way through it. I mean, he did not let it get him down, and he just tipped his head forward and just bullied his way through, and got done with high school way ahead of schedule from his bed, and got accepted at Princeton University. He was like, yes, I'm going to Princeton. And showed up there when he was 16 years old. And he had this kind of funny little tilt to his head, and his jaw was just a little, didn't slow him down a bit. And he became a chemist. And as the story goes, Madame Curie came to the U.S. on a tour or something. This is after she got her Nobel Prize stuff. In the early part of the 20th century, 19-something, and met Allier, and I think he was her sidekick or assistant when she was on the Princeton campus, or, I don't know what the title would be, but he was just kind of a harmless guy, and got to know her a little bit. And there are many stories we'll tell about how she interacted with Madame Curie. You'll get the giggles when you hear these stories. Well, she heard Allier speak, and he had to struggle to overcome the deformity in his jaw, because he would blow slobber out the side of his mouth. So he had to really work at it to get himself to talk correctly. And it was very impressive what he was doing. So when he was in front of a group of people, everybody listened. And so Madame Curie said, Hubert, you are the next Faraday, because you can hold an audience. And so just that little side mark, people, so to have Madame Curie, who you can imagine all the scientists are there to suck up to her and go, oh, you're so wonderful, please can I say, and she goes, now Hubert Allier, that young man over there, he's the next Michael Faraday. And it's like, oh, really? Oh, my God. So he became a chemistry professor at Princeton, and was just a world-class lecturer. And his favorite group of kids were non-science majors. He said, he was a chemistry professor, but there were a bunch of students that had to, I got to take chemistry. Yuck, I don't want to take it. So they had to suffer through it. And so there would be this huge lab, 200, 300 kids in class. They go, yeah, let's take the chemistry, let's get it over with, we got it. So Dr. Allier would leave his advanced studies and come teach that class. Well, it was a wild ride. And he had those kids mesmerized, and he was blowing up chickens and doing all this stuff. I mean, and his lecture demonstrations were picked up by teachers around the world. Right down the street from his house lived a physicist that moved from Germany. His name was Albert Einstein. Can you imagine having Einstein as your neighbor? This is kind of bizarre. And Allier befriended him a little bit. Einstein would try to avoid the press, because they would always catch him, scratching his head or picking his nose, or one of those fingers. He's getting ready to eat some ice cream, and of course all the cameras go off, So Einstein would spend his Sunday afternoons on the Princeton golf course, because you had to be a member to get on the course. So that was his refuge. Go out there and sit under the trees. Nobody's around, except Allier, his neighbor down the street. And the story goes, I think Allier's son played with Einstein's grand. I can't remember. I'll have to look that up before we talk about him. So they were kind of buddies, and they would talk about things. And World War II comes along, and they want Allier to be in charge of gas warfare for the United States, because we were sure the Germans were going to use gas, because at the end of World War I, they were starting the use of gas, and they thought, well, if the Germans do attack the U.S., how are they going to do it with gas? So Hubert Allier was contracted to be to lead this group of scientists to fight the gas warfare they thought was coming. And he got a captain for each state, and the captain for New Jersey was Albert Einstein. Can you believe this? So they came up with these anti-gas warfare scenarios. I just love to, it's just the meetings that must have been. Well, they didn't do any anti-gas warfare stuff, thank goodness. But it did get Allier connected. So right after World War II and the atom bomb went off, everybody in the world's going, what in the world is atomic energy? What was that? And people, this is Armageddon. This is the end of the world. Terrified. So the United Nations sent Allier around. I think he eventually visited 88 countries and doing a lecture, Atomic Energy, Weapon for Peace. And he explained to everybody what this new thing, atomic energy, was. And people go, oh, I see. Okay. We don't need to panic. We still have to deal with it, but we don't have to panic about it. And some people would say, Allier prevented World War III. Now, I don't know. But later on, he was speaking at the Brussels World's Fair, doing some science demonstrations. And he would do it like 6 times a day. And there was some guy sitting in the back row who sat in on 3 or 4 sessions, one after another, at the World's Fair in Brussels, and came up to him after the 3rd or 4th show and said, my name is Walt Disney. And Allier didn't know who he was. He said, tell me all about this. So a year or 2 later, there's a movie called The Absent-Minded Professor. And there are bits and pieces of that movie are from real life. Like Flubber was a takeoff of the discovery of Teflon, the Nobel Prize winning thing. But this magic material had all these strange properties. So that's when he got celebrated and started lecturing and became world famous, and he went around the world again demonstrating how to teach chemistry in the strangest places and how to think like a scientist. And he was our exhibit at the American exhibit. Allier was the exhibit at the World's Fair in Seattle, and that's the first time I met him. It was in '61, when he was the exhibit for the American. It's like everybody else has got robots and all this stuff, and here we got this little old man, and he was at the World's Fair, and that's when I first met Allier. Was at the World's Fair in 1961. And he was a wonderful speaker.
Let me interject a question related to your relationship with as a student of his. What can you say about his personality and his presentation skills?
Well, I tell you, if you remember your college days and you got into a class, you could see kids, their heads would bob. Oh, I fell asleep. Your head would bob when you fell asleep. Nobody ever fell asleep in one of his classes. I mean, I was in heaven when I took classes from him. I got to spend a summer. They had these institutes where you could go spend a summer there and spend time with him. And he was the jolliest. It was like going to Santa Claus house or something. When you're a kid, it was just like, man, I'm here. And he was so human. You've been in classes when the professor is a professor, and very not pompous, but they're there. They have a strong presence and a thick ego, and by the grace of Heavenly Father, you're allowed to be in my presence. And Allie, come here, give me a hug. Let's learn some chemistry together, you know. Are you having trouble? What trouble are you having understanding this? And he could just, the hardest concepts, he just pour them down your throat like warm honey. I understand this. It's simple. I said, oh, yes. It's not a problem. This sweetest, kindest man. And, you know, you look back in his heyday, he was in Life magazine on the cover, you know, just, he was just infamous for his ability to capture an audience and just, and, you know, you ask him once, when you ask Allie, that was the thing, ask all three of the wizards, the four wizards, what's the key to your presence? And the word was humility. It said humility is the key. You know, if you have an ego, you need to knock yourself down off that thing and just, you don't have to prove anything to anybody, you know. So he was the most humble man. So was Faraday, yeah, humble. I haven't achieved that myself yet. I'm going to get there. I'm going to be the most humble man on the planet Earth. So anyway, that's how Allie developed his wizard presence, was all those things together. They were saying this man was the science communicator. It was like, that's an example of a science communicating. And people would often compare him off the record to Michael Faraday. They said, yeah, he's like old Faraday. He was a good scientist, and he worked on something called chemical inhibitors. Sometimes it's easy to get a chemical action to start. But it's like getting a boulder rolling down a hill. Yeah, once you get it up over the bump and get it rolling, hey, that's great. Now, how do you stop that thing? How do you inhibit it? I said, oh, ooh, that's the whole thing I never thought of. I like to light a firecracker fuse. How do you stop it? So, you know, that was great. And that was a big part of his work was chemical inhibition and in his professional career.
So let's move on to Wizard 3. And Jake, I was one of those kids who was glued to the TV screen on Saturday mornings as Don Herbert, Mr. Wizard, conducted experiments and demonstrations with his young apprentices in his studio lab. Can you share with us your special connection with him as you learned the art of being a science communicator firsthand?
Oh yeah, now we're getting into my life. I think the year was 51 when Don started on television. And we'll get into his life. He was a bomber pilot in World War II and had some harrowing experiences which helped shape his character. And we'll get into that in detail. So he was a tough cracker. You know, he was captain of a bomber, you know, B-24, flew 56 missions and was shot at many times and escaped death. And so he had a presence like a hand grenade. Just when he walked into the room, you knew he was there, right? So when he was on camera, you're just mesmerized by him, and millions of kids would watch him, NBC on Saturday mornings, just, oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. And I was one of those, just like you. And he would do something, and as soon as the show was over, I got to do that. I would try to do as many of those as I possibly could. And he was my, I guess, idol. I don't know what the word is when you're that age, you know, but he's the reason I got into science, no doubt about it, you know, just no doubt about it, watching that show. And I remember once they did a survey, I think it was at NASA, or some event, just a public event. And they had all the engineers and NASA scientists were there doing some cocktail party or whatever they were doing, I don't know. And they did Don was there for the launch of something. And they did a little quick survey. And it was like 2/3 of the scientists there said, I got my start with Mr. Wizard at this function. Who are they? Said, oh yeah, Mr. Wizard turned me on to science. And I've met Nobel Prize winners who said, oh yeah, Mr. Wizard. So his presence was strong and mighty, and there I was in the fields of the Midwest, poor town USA. My dad was a firefighter, and I'd watch that, and I said, oh, I want to be that kid there. I want to light that fuse. I want to turn that button. And there's no chance, though, because I was, one step away from a hillbilly, and I've got a thick hillbilly blood in me, so I can use that word. And I thought, no, there's no way that I would ever get to associate that. And I got to meet him a few times, forced my way up in a crowd at some meetings. There he is, Mr. Wizard. Oh my God, it's him, it's him, it's him. And he was, I think it was in the late 70s, early 80s. They were developing this new thing called cable television. Ooh, cable. Going to get rid of those antennas and run cables. No, that'll never happen. And Jerry Laybourne, who was a former teacher, was president of Nickelodeon. And this new cable thing. And she said, I'd like to bring Mr. Wizard back, because she was one of us, a Mr. Wizard fan. And he was saying, no, that'll never fly. Cable television, they're not going to be running cables to everybody's house. That's just ridiculous. Well, lo and behold, they did. And so they did a show, Mr. Wizard's World. It was called Watch Mr. Wizard was the NBC series for all those years. He did thousands of shows, by the way, thousands. And the Nickelodeon series, it was a challenge for him because it had to be a magazine format instead of a plotted storyline like the old shows were, the black and white shows that you kind of work through the process. And of course, modern television, no, we can't take that much time. We got to go chop, 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 chop. It's got to be snappy. So that was hard for him, but he did it. But he needed some help. He said, he was born in 1917, so he was saying, I need help. And I had been active in the National Science Teachers Association, and eventually got onto the board. I was division director for informal science there. But I'm a life member of the NSTA. And I got to meet him at a couple of conventions. I got to meet Mr. Wizard. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And he autographed the book and sat down and had a Coke with me. And I said, oh. So when the demands of the cable thing, he needed some assistance. He called the NSTA. And he knew the director, they were friends. He said, hey, I need somebody who can help me do the demos. And he said, and Bill Aldridge, who was the director of the NSTA, said, I know this character, but he's from the Midwest. He's not Hollywood, something like that. But he's a chemist and physics instructor. But he's also a carpenter. He builds museum exhibits and sets and things, so he's handy with stuff like that. So one day I was walking down the hallway of my house, and the phone rang, and I picked it up and I said, is this Jake? And I said, well, yeah. Who's this? And he said, well, this is Don Herbert, Mr. Wizard, you might know me as. And I said, oh, sure it is, Greg. And I hung up. Because I had a friend, Greg, who would call me up all the time. Oh, yeah. My dear friend, Greg, my lifelong buddy, would call me up. This is Senator Bob Dole requesting, and he'd call me up, and say these things. And I thought, yeah, Greg, Mr. Wizard. So a little while later, the phone rang again. He said, now don't hang up on me. And we talked, and I about had a stroke and a heart attack right there. Whoa. So I got to fly to Hollywood. And when we do the Mr. Wizard, I go in the whole deal, but I got there and got the job as his science advisor. And that's what started that lifelong, my life started as a science communicator started there. But I had been active in doing science presentations and shows and workshops, for teachers and for public groups and science museums before I got to work with Mr. Wizard. And we'll get to that. But that's where that contact was made, was through the NSTA. And it lasted until the day he passed away, And I would go out and live in his house, stay in his house, or an apartment nearby in the Hollywood area, in the canyon outside of the Hollywood Hills, and we worked on lots of projects together. And then finally he came to my hometown, and we had kind of a ceremony that he said, Joel, I'm passing this on to you. And we went to London on a trip together with our families, my wife and my mother and his wife, and we went to London to visit the Royal Institution. And they had a ceremony there and made us fellows, which was like, I thought I was in heaven. It was the end of the world for me. It's like, oh, okay, it's over. So that's when we and that's when we sat down, and Doc Allier was still alive. And so we got on the phone and said, you know, we've got to, up until that point, the whole wizard thing had never been firmed up. It was just kind of like, yeah, who's the head man with this fishing boat here? Well, whoever's wearing the hat is the captain, you know, is that kind of thing. So we knew that Allier had always looked at Faraday as his role model, and Mr. Wizard always looked at Allier and Faraday, and he said, yeah, I'm thinking. So Allier said, well, Don, you know, you're the man in the cat seat now. You're the wizard. Is that why you called yourself Mr. Wizard? And we'll come back to that. But he actually came up with the word Mr. Wizard on an elevator between floors. I got to come up with a name for this show. I got 30 seconds before the elevator opens. So we put that's when we put together, and Peter Day, who was the director of the Royal Institution, he said, we need to formalize this lineage. Yeah, so we did. Talked to Dr. Allier, and on behalf of Faraday, who was long since passed, Peter Day, Professor Peter Day, the director, said, I'll stand in for Faraday because we hold the same chair at the institution. We hold that chair. So that's when we assembled the 1, 2, 3, 4 thing with the terrible responsibility that, Jake, you've got to find 5. And then we realized that Wizard 6 was probably just being born. You know, that Wizard 5 is probably in their 20s or 30s or something like that right now. And Wizard 6 probably just popped into existence.
Thank you for your retrospectives and gathering those many scattered thoughts for today's session. In our upcoming session, Jake will go in depth about each of the wizards and their unique contributions as science wizards.